In 1871, a German explorer named Karl Mauck was guided to massive stone walls, 11 meters high, 250 meters long, 1 million blocks of granite, fitted so precisely that you cannot slip a knife blade between them. No mortar, no cement, just stone fitting into stone. With geometric perfection, Mauch looked at these walls and made a decision that would echo for a century. He said, "This is impossible. Africans could not have built this." He invented a lie. The Queen of Sheba, biblical Ophir, anything but the truth. That lie would be weaponized. A British imperialist named Cecil Rhodes, a man whose entire fortune came from stealing African gold, used Mauck's lie to justify colonization. If these ruins weren't built by Africans, then they weren't part of African heritage. And if they weren't part of African heritage, then taking African land wasn't theft, it was civilization. Rhodes financed an amateur archaeologist named J. Theodore Bent to prove the European origins. Bent came and did exactly what he was paid to do, lie professionally. For 100 years, the world believed this lie. 100 years. And then, in 1929, a woman named Gertrude Kittons Thompson arrived with scientific rigor, with evidence, with the truth. She proved absolutely that Great Zimbabwe was built entirely by Africans, medieval African architects, medieval African engineers, medieval African vision, but the truth was suppressed, censored, hidden, and that story, the conspiracy to erase an entire civilization, is the story I want to tell you right now. At minute 16, I'm going to show you the exact moment when the Rhodesian government expelled the archaeologist who tried to tell the truth, and why they did it. But first, you need to see what was being erased. Walk with me to the greatest empire Africa ever built. This is not just a story about a lost city. This is a story about power. About the power to deny. About the power to erase. About the power to rewrite history so completely that an entire civilization disappears from human memory. Great Zimbabwe was one of the largest cities in the world in the year 1400, 20,000 people, larger than London, comparable to Paris, built entirely by African hands on African earth. But that fact was so threatening to European power structures that an entire conspiracy was created to deny it. Scientists were bribed. Archaeologists were paid to lie. Evidence was suppressed. And when the truth finally emerged, it was censored by a government that needed the lie more than it needed the facts. Why? Because if Great Zimbabwe existed, if Africans built a civilization that rivaled anything in Europe, then the entire justification for colonization collapsed. The entire narrative of European superiority crumbled, and so the truth was buried, not in the ground, but in silence. For 400 years, the world did not know that Great Zimbabwe existed, and when they did find out, they were told it wasn't really African. This video is about that conspiracy. It's about how it was created. It's about how it was maintained. And it's about the women and men who risked everything to tell the truth. Let me give you the numbers that make this impossible to ignore. In the year 1400, the city of Great Zimbabwe covered more than 700 hectares. That's enormous. That's a city, a real city. The population was between 18,000 and 20,000 people. London in 1400, approximately 30,000. Paris in 1400. Approximately 50,000, so Great Zimbabwe was not a small settlement. It was a major city, a major metropolitan center comparable to the greatest cities of medieval Europe. But here's what makes this truly impossible. The construction. The walls were built with 1 million blocks of granite. 1 million. Each block cut, each block shaped, each block positioned with precision so exact that they fit together without mortar, without cement, without any adhesive, just stone fitting into stone through geometry alone. To give you scale, The Great Pyramids of Egypt took hundreds of years to build and required the resources of the richest empire in the world. Great Zimbabwe's walls were built without centralized state resources, without written records of the project, without the bureaucratic apparatus that Egypt had, and they were built to last for 500 years. The architectural sophistication was equivalent to anything built in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East during the same period. But here's the part that made Western academia very uncomfortable. There were no European architects present. There were no Middle Eastern engineers. There were no Asian influence. This was African innovation, African engineering, African vision, and inside these walls there was a government, a sophisticated government, a religious apparatus, an economic system, a class structure, all managed by Africans, all created by Africans, all organized by African intelligence. The city was not isolated. It was globally connected. Porcelain from China's Ming Dynasty has been found in the ruins. Glass from Syria, beads from Persia, ceramics from Arab lands. The trade networks stretched across the Indian Ocean to Asia, across the Sahara to the Arab world, across Africa to other trading centers. This was not a local economy. This was medieval globalization centered in Africa, and the world decided to pretend it never existed. Before Great Zimbabwe, there was Mapungubwe. Say it, Mapungubwe. This was the dominant power in southern Africa from 1220 to 1280. Mapungubwe controlled the gold. Mapungubwe controlled the trade routes. Mapungubwe was the center of power, but in 1280, the environment changed. The climate became drier. The water sources became unreliable. The land could no longer support a large population. And Mapungubwe collapsed. Not to invasion, to environmental stress, to the inability of the land to sustain the city. As Mapungubwe fell, power shifted north. The control of the gold routes moved north. The control of the trade networks moved north. The center of gravity in southern Africa moved from the southern plateau to the northern plateau. And on that northern plateau, a new power rose. Great Zimbabwe, not through military conquest, through economic domination. Great Zimbabwe controlled the Phi gold supply. Great Zimbabwe controlled the routes to the sea. And as Mapungubwe weakened, Great Zimbabwe grew. By 1300, Great Zimbabwe was the dominant power. The king, the Mambo, ruled from behind massive stone walls. The walls grew higher. The city grew larger. The population increased. The wealth accumulated. The transition from Mapungubwe to Great Zimbabwe teaches us something critical. Power is not permanent. Empires do not last forever. The environment that sustains one generation can destroy the next, and the power that dominates one era can be displaced by another power that understands the new geography better. Great Zimbabwe understood. For the next 200 years, it would dominate the southern subcontinent. The wealth of Great Zimbabwe came from gold. The Zimbabwe Plateau held vast deposits. The people developed sophisticated mining techniques. They extracted the gold using iron tools. They refined it to trade purity, but gold alone is useless if you cannot sell it. Great Zimbabwe solved this through genius, the creation of a trade network that connected Africa to the entire world. The gold flowed south from the plateau. Through rivers, through trade routes, it reached the port city of Sofala on the Indian Ocean. Say it, Sofala. Sofala was a coastal city, a point of exchange between the African interior and the maritime trade networks. From Sofala, the gold moved north by ship. It traveled up the African coast to the island city of Kilwa Kisiwani. Say it, Kalwa Kisiwani. Kilwa was an island city-state in what is now Tanzania. It was a major port, a major trading hub. Kilwa became phenomenally wealthy because of Great Zimbabwe's gold. Kilwa became the dominant port of the Indian Ocean. The gold from the interior flowed through Kilwa, and from Kilwa it was distributed to the Arab world, to Persia, to Asia. The Ming dynasty of China wanted gold. Arab merchants wanted gold. Persian traders wanted gold. Kilwa controlled the supply because Great Zimbabwe controlled the source. The Swahili people of the coast, descendants of Arab-African mixing, controlled the maritime routes. They became fabulously wealthy by being the middlemen, and Great Zimbabwe in the interior was the engine, the gold mine that powered the entire system. The evidence of this global network is overwhelming. In the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, archaeologists have found Chinese Ming porcelain, Syrian glass, Arab coins, Persian ceramics. The goods flowed in both directions. Great Zimbabwe sent gold out. The world's luxury goods flowed in. This was not a local economy. This was medieval globalization. Great Zimbabwe was as connected to the world as any medieval power. Connected to China, connected to Persia, connected to Arabia, connected to Africa's coast, connected to everything. And Europe had no idea this network existed. The king of Great Zimbabwe held absolute power. But absolute power needs justification. It needs legitimacy. How do you keep 20,000 people in submission? How do you extract tribute? How do you maintain hierarchy? You use religion. The Shona people believed in Mawari. Say it, Mari Aha, a supreme creator god, a god of earth, fertility and rain. Rain was critical. In Africa, agriculture depends on seasonal rainfall. Rain determines whether people eat or starve. The king positioned himself as the only person who could communicate with Mwari, the only intercessor, the only intermediary with ancestral spirits, the only person who could guarantee rain. This religious monopoly was enforced absolutely. There were rules, laws, divine consequences. If a common person tried to communicate directly with Mwari, the consequences were devastating. They would be struck with leprosy, divine disease. The threat was literal and terrifying. The symbols of this divine power were the birds. Statues carved in steatite showing birds of prey with human characteristics. These were the messengers, the connection between living kings and dead ancestors. Connection to Mwari, the birds of Zimbabwe. Sophisticated ideology, not primitive belief. A system designed to justify absolute power through religious control. The architectural expression of this power was the walls. The great enclosure, the hill complex. The king lived inside. The people lived outside. The walls said everything about the relationship between the powerful and the powerless. Separation, hierarchy, absolute distinction, and it worked. The people believed it. They genuinely believed that the king could control rain. They genuinely believed that disobeying the religious laws would bring divine punishment. The religious ideology maintained order. It justified extraction of tribute. It kept the population compliant. This is sophisticated. This is not primitive. This is complex statecraft using ideology as a tool. This is a government that understood psychology, theology, and power. And it worked for 200 years. By the mid-1500s, the elite of Great Zimbabwe had grown bloated. The ruling class had expanded. There were too many princes, too many nobles competing for power. Too many people wanting a share of the wealth. The paranoia set in. Political intrigue, conspiracies, the unity that had built, the city began to fracture from within. A prince named Nyatsimba Mutota, say it, Nyatsimba Mutata, was sent north by the king. The official reason, to find new sources of salt. Salt was valuable. Trade in salt was profitable. Finding new reserves would increase wealth and power. Mutota went north with an army, but he never came back. Instead, he used that army to conquer the northern tribes, the Tonga, the Tavara. He did not return to the king. He declared independence. He founded his own empire, the Mutapa Empire. Say it, Motapa. This was catastrophic. Mutota had cut off the northern gold sources. He had seized control of those trade routes. He had taken the army. He had taken the resources. More catastrophically, his rebellion demonstrated something critical. The king was not invincible. The divine mandate was not absolute. A prince could challenge the king and win. The secession of Mutota cracked the foundation of Great Zimbabwe. The economy was disrupted. The trade networks were severed. The political unity was shattered. The king had lost control of critical resources, and the population knew it. The religious ideology that had sustained the empire began to lose power. If the king could not control his own son, if the king could not prevent rebellion, if the king could not maintain the empire, then was the king really divine? Could the king really communicate with Mori? Could the king really guarantee reign? The internal collapse showed something that empires always face. Succession is the moment of truth, the moment when power is tested, the moment when unity either survives or shatters. Great Zimbabwe did not survive the test. The true destruction of Great Zimbabwe was not military. It was environmental. It was self-inflicted. To build those massive stone walls, the people of Great Zimbabwe needed to quarry granite. Granite is hard. You cannot cut it with bronze tools. You need iron. And to work iron, you need heat. You need fire. The technique was simple. Build a fire on the granite. Heat it to extreme temperatures. Then throw cold water on it. The thermal shock fractures the stone. You can then move the fragments and shape them. It works, it is effective, but it requires enormous amounts of wood, enormous quantities of fuel. Day after day, year after year, for centuries, 20,000 people needed fuel. They needed wood for cooking, wood for heating homes, wood for the iron foundries, wood for the survival of the population. The deforestation was total, complete. Within a few hundred years, all the trees for kilometers around the city had been cut down. The land became barren. The soil became exposed. The erosion accelerated. The landscape that had sustained the city became a wasteland. The problem worsened with cattle. The elite of Great Zimbabwe measured wealth in cattle. Tens of thousands of cattle grazed around the city. These cattle overgrazed the land. They destroyed grass. They compacted soil. They consumed the vegetation. The land became unable to recover. The fertility collapsed. The water systems failed. The massive infrastructure of tanks and reservoirs that had been engineered to manage water became contaminated. In a city without sewage systems, without sanitation, water became a vector for disease. Dysentery spread, cholera spread, waterborne diseases killed people. The mortality rate increased. The population began to sicken, and then the rains changed. The climate shifted. The good fortune that had sustained Great Zimbabwe vanished. The soil was exhausted. The forests were gone. The water systems were fouled. The grasslands were barren. The cattle were starving. And the king, the Mambo, had lost his central claim, the ability to guarantee rain. Without rain, there was no harvest. Without harvest, there was starvation. Without harvest, the king's divine power was revealed as an illusion. The trade routes that had brought wealth were disrupted by Mutota's secession. The internal economy was collapsing. The external economy was failing. The environmental foundation was destroyed. and the ideological structure was crumbling. The city did not fall to a foreign invader. It was not conquered by a rival power. It fell because it ate its own foundation. It cut down the forests it needed. It overgrazed the land it depended on. It contaminated the water it drank. And when the environment could no longer sustain it, the city simply began to empty, not suddenly, not in a single catastrophe, but gradually, over decades, over generations. The population migrated. Some went north to join Mutopa's empire. Some went to other regions. The city was left to the jungle. The walls remained, but the people were gone. By 1550, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. It would not be found again by the world for 300 years. Great Zimbabwe was abandoned by the mid-1500s. The forest reclaimed the city. The stones remained. The structures survived, but the knowledge of who built them was lost in the chaos of colonial intrusion. For 300 years, it was forgotten. Then in 1871, Karl Maus arrived, and the conspiracy began. When Mauk saw the massive stone walls, his first reaction was to deny. He looked at 1 million perfectly placed granite blocks and said, "Africans couldn't build this." He invented an explanation. The Queen of Sheba, the biblical port of Ophir, ancient Phoenicians, anything but African agency. Maus was not alone. This was the consensus of European academia. The core node assumption was that Africans couldn't build. Africans weren't capable of civilization. Any evidence of sophistication had to have come from outside, from Europe, from the Middle East, from anywhere but Africa itself. Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist, saw opportunity. If the ruins weren't built by Africans, then they weren't part of African heritage. If they weren't part of African heritage, then taking African land wasn't theft. It was civilization. Rhodes financed an expedition in the 1890s. He hired J. Theodore Bent, an amateur archaeologist. Bent came to Great Zimbabwe and did exactly what he was paid to do. He published papers claiming the structures were medieval Arab or Phoenician, not African, anything but African. The academic consensus accepted this. For decades, the consensus was that Great Zimbabwe was not African. It was foreign. It was other. In 1929, something changed. A woman named Gertrude Caton Thompson led an archaeological expedition to Great Zimbabwe. She was an expert trained in Egypt. She understood modern archaeological methods, rigorous methods, scientific methods. Caton Thompson used stratigraphic dating, precise layer-by-layer analysis. She examined the artifacts, the pottery, the construction techniques, and she concluded what should have been obvious. Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, built in the medieval period, built by the people who lived there. She published her findings. She presented evidence. She was clear. The academic consensus was wrong, completely wrong, deliberately wrong. But the British Empire didn't want this truth. Rhodesia, the white settler, colony controlling the territory, didn't want this truth. If Great Zimbabwe was African, then Africans had built civilization. If Africans had built civilization, then the justification for colonization collapsed. The narrative of European superiority shattered. In the 1960s and 1970s, when archaeologists like Peter Garlake tried to further prove the African origins, they were suppressed. Garlake was expelled. His research was censored. The Rhodesian government controlled the narrative, not because it was false, because it was true, and the truth was politically inconvenient. Great Zimbabwe was destroyed twice. First, by environmental collapse in 1550. Second, by historical erasure in 1871. The physical city was abandoned. The historical city was denied. For 2 centuries, the world was told a lie. A lie designed to deny African capability. A lie designed to justify colonization. A lie that lasted until archaeology and women like Gertrude Catton Thompson insisted on truth. Today, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe are recognized. They are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Archaeologists have confirmed African, medieval, sophisticated, real. But how many people know this? How many students are taught about Great Zimbabwe in school? How many people understand that Africa built civilizations that rivaled anything in Europe? The conspiracy lasted 400 years, and it left a scar on human forethought, consciousness. A scar that says African history is less important, African achievement is less real, African agency is questionable. This video is about undoing that scar. The story of Great Zimbabwe is a story about power. Power to build, power to destroy, power to deny, power to erase. It's a story about how a civilization can be destroyed, not by invaders, but by its own environmental choices. By the decisions to cut every tree, to overgraze every field, to contaminate every water source. It's a story about how truth can be suppressed, how a conspiracy of silence can erase an entire history, how racism embedded in scientific institutions can deny the obvious, can deny the evidence, can deny the achievement. It's a story about how women like Gertrude Catton Thompson can challenge that silence, can insist on truth, can demand that evidence be respected. And it's a story about you, about how you consume history, about what you believe, about whether you accept the narratives handed to you, or whether you ask questions. Great Zimbabwe was real. It was African. It was sophisticated. It was magnificent. The world should know. And if you think that's an incredible story of power and erasure and conspiracy, wait until you see what happened in India, because there's another empire, another story, another conspiracy. The empire of Vijayanagara, an empire so wealthy, so powerful, so magnificent that it rivaled every kingdom in the world. An empire that fell not to environmental collapse, but to the greatest tragedy in military history. A betrayal, a moment, one decision, made by two generals in the middle of a battle, and the entire empire was destroyed. This is a story of absolute power, of betrayal, of an 80-year-old king losing everything in a single day because of a choice made by his own generals. It is the most stunning, most heartbreaking, most awe-inspiring story of power and fall I have encountered in history, and it is waiting for you. Stay with me. Watch Vijayanagara. The story gets better.